Case number 1. Matthew and Joseph Herkin. Matthew and Joseph Herkin were brothers from Princeton, New Jersey, raised in a wealthy and highly educated household. Their parents were professionals, and the family was well known in the community. From the outside, the Herkins appeared stable and successful. Inside the home, however, the family was dealing with a rapidly escalating mental health crisis that would end in violence. Matthew Herkin was in his early 30s. In the weeks leading up to February 2025, his mental condition had deteriorated sharply. Family members later described behavior consistent with paranoia, delusions, and what legal filings would later describe as an acute psychotic break. Matthew spoke about disturbing visions and thoughts that alarmed those around him. His behavior had become erratic and increasingly disconnected from reality. Joseph Herkin, known to friends as Joey, was younger. He was a former Division I soccer player who had competed at the University of Michigan. He was athletic, disciplined, and well-regarded by those who knew him. At the time of the incident, Joseph was living in the family's Princeton home and continuing to build his post-college life. On February 22, 2025, Matthew had contact with family members earlier in the day. One of his brothers spent time with him and became deeply concerned by Matthew's mental state. According to later statements, Matthew spoke openly about frightening visions and thoughts that suggested he was losing control. Fearing for everyone's safety, the brothers sent a text message to Joseph approximately 1 hour before the killing, urging him to stay alert and to reach out immediately if he needed help. That warning came too late. Later that evening, inside the family home, Matthew allegedly attacked Joseph. According to sworn police affidavits and court records, the assault was extreme and sustained. Investigators allege that Matthew used both a knife and a golf club during the attack. Joseph suffered multiple traumatic injuries and died inside the residence. Authorities found no evidence of forced entry or an outside intruder. After Joseph was killed, the violence did not stop. Court documents allege that Matthew mutilated his brother's body, including the removal of one of Joseph's eyes. Prosecutors further allege that Matthew attempted to consume it. These allegations were included in formal filings and presented as part of the state's evidence, reflecting the severity of the psychotic episode investigators believe was unfolding. Matthew was also accused of killing the family cat during the same episode. According to police reports, the animal was killed and set on fire inside the home. This act would directly lead to the discovery of the crime. Police were not initially responding to a homicide call. Emergency services were dispatched to the Herkin residence after receiving a report of a residential fire. When officers and firefighters entered the home, they encountered a scene that quickly escalated from a fire response to a major homicide investigation. Matthew was taken into custody at the scene without resistance. Officers reported that he appeared detached and disoriented. He did not attempt to flee. The condition of the home and the nature of the injuries immediately raised concerns about Matthew's mental competency. Matthew Herkin was charged with multiple serious offenses, including first-degree murder, weapons violations, and animal cruelty. Prosecutors described the case as one of extreme violence, while also acknowledging that Matthew's mental health would be a central issue in all proceedings. As of early 2026, the case remains active within the New Jersey court system. Matthew has not been sentenced. Psychiatric evaluations, competency hearings, and pre-trial motions have significantly shaped the timeline. No death penalty applies, as New Jersey abolished capital punishment in 2007. Joseph Herkin's death sent shockwaves through Princeton and beyond. Friends and former teammates remembered him as disciplined, driven, and full of potential. For his parents, the outcome was devastating in a uniquely cruel way. One son lost to violence, the other facing the possibility of spending his life in prison. Investigators have emphasized that this case was not driven by financial motives or a sudden argument. Instead, it appears to have been the result of an acute psychotic break that unfolded rapidly and violently. Unlike many family homicide cases, the warning signs were not buried in the past. They were immediate, they were recognized, they were communicated. The Herkin case stands as a stark example of how untreated or uncontrolled mental illness, when it reaches a breaking point, can destroy an entire family in a matter of hours. One son was unable to recognize reality. The other never had a chance to escape it. For Joseph's former teammates at the University of Michigan, the news was a surreal nightmare. For the town of Princeton, it was a reminder that behind the most polished doors, a private crisis can suddenly become a public tragedy.
Case number 2. Stribbling and Singleton. The city of Southfield, Michigan is a bustling suburb of Detroit, known for its residential stability in quiet apartment complexes. But in January 2021, the 12 North Apartments became the site of a crime so senseless and cold-blooded that it would take years for the legal system to fully process the horror. This was not a case of two adult brothers locked in a lifelong feud, or a psychotic break fueled by delusions. Instead, it was the story of 20-year-old Stribbling and his 8-year-old sister, Singleton. A tragedy defined by a total collapse of the sibling bond and an unimaginable act of violence against a defenseless child. Singleton was just beginning her life. Described by those who knew her as a bright, energetic 8-year-old girl, she was the heart of her family. Like any young child, she was curious and spirited. On the other hand, her older brother, Stribbling, was an adult of 20. The age gap between them should have meant that served as a protector, a role common in many households where an older brother looks out for a younger sister. However, inside their family home, a much darker dynamic was simmering, one where a minor moment of childhood defiance would be met with lethal force. On the day of the incident, the atmosphere inside the apartment shifted from domestic routine to a nightmare in a matter of seconds. According to prosecutors and court testimony, the confrontation began over something incredibly trivial. Bailey was reportedly talking back to her older brother, the kind of ordinary, everyday sass that occurs in almost every household with children across the world. In any other home, this might have resulted in a lecture, a timeout, or a loss of privileges. But Stribbling did not respond with words or discipline. Instead, he retrieved a firearm. In a moment that defies logic, pointed the weapon at his 8-year-old sister and pulled the trigger. Bailey was struck in the head at close range. The violence was instantaneous and final. There was no struggle, no long-standing rivalry, and no heat of passion that could ever justify the use of a deadly weapon against a second grader. When the gunshot rang out through the 12 North Apartments, the life of a young girl was extinguished and a family was fractured beyond repair. What happened next was a calculated attempt to escape accountability. When police and emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found a chaotic and heartbreaking environment. Rather than confessing to the act or showing immediate remorse, Stribbling crafted a fabrication. He told investigators that the shooting was the result of an attempted robbery. He claimed that an intruder had entered the home and that Bailey had been caught in the crossfire of a violent struggle. It was a story designed to prey on the fears of the community, the idea of a random predator entering a home to do harm. However, the Southfield Police Department and local investigators were thorough. As they processed the scene, the robbery narrative began to crumble. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing of value had been taken. Most importantly, the forensic evidence did not align with a struggle involving an outsider. During a detailed search of the premises, investigators uncovered the smoking gun, a hidden weapon that had attempted to conceal before the authorities arrived. The ballistics matched the wound that killed Bailey. The intruder story was a lie, and the focus shifted entirely to the man who was supposed to be her guardian. The legal journey to justice was long. The case moved through the Michigan court system over the course of 4 years, a period filled with grief for the family and intense scrutiny of Jayassi's actions. During the trial, the prosecution was clear. This was not an accident. They argued that the act of retrieving a gun, aiming it at a child's head, and pulling the trigger met every requirement for first-degree murder. They emphasized that the motive, Bailey talking back, highlighted a level of malice and disregard for human life that was chilling. In April 2025, a jury in Oakland County heard the final evidence. They deliberated on the initial lies Gyasi told, the hidden weapon, and the sheer vulnerability of the victim. They returned a verdict of guilty on the charge of first-degree murder. In the state of Michigan, a conviction for first-degree premeditated murder carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Gyasi Stribbling, the sentence for his anger was the total forfeiture of his future. As of May 2025, his formal sentencing was scheduled, but the impact of his actions was already permanent. The Stribbling-Singleton family was left in an impossible position. They had lost Bailey to a grave, and they had lost Gyasi to the prison system. The community was left to wonder how such explosive rage could exist between siblings with such a significant age gap. The case of Gyasi Stribbling and Bailey Singleton stands as one of the most disturbing examples of domestic violence in recent Michigan history. It serves as a grim case study on the intersection of firearm access and uncontrolled temper. Unlike other cases where mental health or long-term feuds provide some context, this case remains haunting because of its simplicity. An 8-year-old girl spoke, and her brother decided she no longer deserved to live. As we reflect on this story, we remember Bailey not as a victim in a court file, but as a child who deserved to grow up, go to school, and be protected by her family. Her story is a stark reminder that the bonds of blood are sometimes the most fragile, and the tragedy can strike in the most ordinary of moments, over the most ordinary of disagreements.
Case number 3. Zachary and Gregory Wittmann. Zachary P. Wittmann and his younger brother Gregory "Greg" Wittmann grew up in New Freedom, Pennsylvania, in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Their family life appeared ordinary from the outside, but underlying tensions existed between the two brothers. By October 1998, those tensions would escalate into a tragedy that shook the community and reverberated for decades. On October 2, 1998, 15-year-old Zachary was home from school, reportedly sick. 13-year-old Greg returned home from the bus stop that afternoon, unaware that a confrontation was about to occur. Investigators later reconstructed the sequence of events through interviews, forensic evidence, and Zachary's eventual confession. The incident began as a minor domestic disagreement. Greg's girlfriend called the house, and Zachary answered the phone. He hung up abruptly, which angered Greg. When Greg arrived home and learned what had happened, he confronted Zachary. The argument escalated rapidly inside the family home, moving through common areas including the kitchen and living room. According to investigative records, Zachary then retrieved a small penknife and a pair of goalie gloves. The gloves became a critical piece of evidence. Investigators noted that their use suggested a level of preparation and intent to avoid getting blood on his hands, contradicting any argument that the attack was purely spontaneous. Zachary's actions indicated a calculated moment immediately before the attack, despite the appearance of a heated argument. During the attack, Zachary stabbed Greg repeatedly, inflicting more than 100 injuries to his head, neck, and hands. The intensity of the assault caused the penknife blade to break off in Greg's body, underscoring the sheer force and rage behind the attack. Greg ultimately collapsed in the laundry room, where he was discovered by first responders. Emergency personnel pronounced him dead at the scene. After the attack, Zachary attempted to distance himself from the evidence. He buried the broken knife and the gloves under a tree in the backyard. He then called 911, telling dispatchers that he had found his brother already dead. Police arrived shortly thereafter, encountering Zachary distressed and covered in blood, with Greg's body lying inside the home. Early forensic analysis quickly revealed inconsistencies in Zachary's account, prompting his arrest and formal charges for the murder of his brother. The legal process was lengthy. Zachary, only 15 at the time, was tried as an adult.
In 2003, a Pennsylvania jury convicted him of first-degree murder and sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His parents maintained that he was innocent, and for years they publicly disputed the conviction, believing that the investigation had overlooked alternative explanations. The case remained unresolved in many ways until 2018. Changes in U.S. juvenile sentencing law, including the Supreme Court ruling that mandatory life without parole for juveniles is unconstitutional, prompted a review of Zachary's sentence. As part of a plea agreement, Zachary admitted to killing his brother, this time providing details that had remained unknown for 2 decades. He stated he acted out of frustration in having a bad day and, importantly, disclosed where he had hidden the remaining evidence. This confession marked the first time his parents and investigators had the full account, highlighting nearly 20 years of uncertainty and grief. Under the plea deal, Zachary pled guilty to third-degree murder, with a sentence range of 15 years and 230 days to 40 years. Because he had already served nearly 20 years, he became eligible for parole in early 2019 and was subsequently released. The Wittmann case underscores how domestic disputes, even among siblings, can escalate with devastating consequences. The use of gloves and the force behind the attack reflected a moment of calculated intent. The delay in the confession illustrates the long-lasting impact on families who must live with uncertainty about the truth. For Gregory, a young life ended abruptly. For Zachary, decades of incarceration were the result of that single catastrophic decision. And for the Wittmann family, 2 decades passed with the shadow of doubt hanging over every day. The tragedy left a lasting mark on the New Freedom community. Friends, neighbors, and former classmates remembered Greg as an ordinary, energetic boy whose life ended too soon. The case also became a reference point in national discussions about juvenile sentencing and the limits of punishment and rehabilitation. When the truth finally emerged in 2018, it brought resolution, but not relief. For the Wittmann parents, the confession meant confronting a second loss, the realization that the belief they had carried for nearly 20 years that their surviving son was innocent was not true. In the end, the truth closed the case, but it also completed the tragedy. Case number 4, Fatiha and Saima Marzan. Fatiha and Saima Marzan were sisters living with their family in Orlando, Florida. They shared a bedroom and were short in age, both in their early 20s. To the outside world, they appeared to be close siblings navigating adulthood together. Privately, however, a deeply personal conflict had been growing, one rooted in jealousy, insecurity, and a shared connection to the same man. According to court records and Fatiha's own confession, Fatiha had been involved in an online romantic relationship with a man for approximately 5 years. The relationship was emotionally significant to her and formed a central part of her identity. Over time, Fatiha became convinced that the man had developed feelings for her younger sister, Saima. Investigators later determined that this belief was not supported by clear evidence. However, Fatiha reportedly became increasingly fixated on the idea that Saima was trying to steal the man from her or that the man had shifted his affection away from her. This belief became the core of the conflict between the sisters. The sisters' shared bedroom became the primary setting for their arguments. Family members later told police that disputes between Fatiha and Saima had become frequent and intense. The arguments were emotional rather than physical, but they were repetitive and unresolved. Saima reportedly denied any involvement with the man. Fatiha did not accept those denials. By September 2022, the jealousy had escalated into obsession. According to Fatiha's statements to investigators, she felt betrayed, humiliated, and emotionally replaced. The conflict was no longer about facts, but about perception. In her mind, the relationship she had invested years in was being taken from her by her own sister. On the night of the killing, the sisters were alone together in their shared bedroom. Another argument broke out, again centered on the man and Fatiha's belief that Saima had crossed a boundary. According to court filings, the confrontation escalated rapidly. At some point during the argument, Fatiha retrieved a knife and attacked Saima. The assault was sudden and violent. Saima suffered fatal stab wounds and collapsed inside the bedroom.
There were no signs of forced entry or an outside intruder. The physical evidence indicated a direct act of violence between the sisters. After the attack, Fatiha attempted to distance herself from the evidence. Emergency services were contacted, and police arrived to find Saima unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Fatiha was taken into custody without resistance. During questioning, Fatiha confessed to killing her sister. She told investigators that jealousy over the man had consumed her and that she believed Saima was trying to take him from her. Prosecutors emphasized that the confession aligned with digital evidence in the history of arguments uncovered during the investigation. Fatiha Marzan was charged with murder. Court documents described the killing as intentional and motivated by jealousy rather than self-defense or accidental violence. Mental health evaluations were ordered, but prosecutors maintained that Fatiha understood her actions and their consequences at the time of the killing. For the Marzan family, the aftermath was devastating. One daughter was dead, the other faced the prospect of decades in prison. The family declined public comment, but the case made clear how a private emotional conflict had escalated into irreversible violence. The Orlando community reacted with shock. Friends and acquaintances struggled to reconcile the image of two sisters who shared a bedroom with the reality that jealousy had turned lethal. Saima was remembered as quiet and private. Fatiha was described as emotionally intense and deeply attached to her online relationship. As the case progressed, prosecutors stressed that this was not a crime driven by strangers, financial pressure, or substance abuse. It was a domestic homicide fueled by perceived betrayal and unchecked jealousy between siblings who lived in close proximity. The Marzan case highlights a classic pattern in sibling homicides, rooted in romantic jealousy. The conflict did not begin with violence. It began with suspicion, insecurity, and obsession, reinforced by constant proximity and private arguments. When the emotional pressure reached its peak, it exploded inside the most intimate space the sisters shared. For Saima Marzan, her life ended in the room she slept. For Fatiha Marzan, her future became defined by a single act driven by jealousy and distorted belief. And for their family, the loss was absolute. One daughter gone, the other forever marked by what she did to her own sister. This case stands as a reminder that some of the most dangerous rivalries are not visible from the outside. They develop quietly, fueled by perception rather than proof, until a private obsession becomes a public tragedy. If you found this case informative, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. A tremendous amount of time and energy goes into researching and presenting these stories accurately, and your support helps us continue bringing you in-depth, carefully researched true crime content.
Case number 5. Delaney Jenkins and his sisters. Delaney Jenkins lived with his mother and siblings in Streamwood, Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. The home on McCool Avenue was busy and crowded, shared by 5 siblings under one roof. To neighbors and people in the community, the family appeared close-knit. There were no public signs of crisis, no visible indication that violence was imminent. That perception would collapse in May 2025. Inside the household, daily life followed a familiar rhythm shaped by shared space, shared responsibilities, and the ordinary tensions that come with a large family. Delaney was one of the older siblings. Family members later told investigators that while disagreements occurred, nothing suggested an immediate threat. There had been no recent police calls to the home, and no reports of ongoing domestic violence. That changed abruptly when authorities received an emergency call reporting a violent incident inside the residence. When police arrived, they discovered that 2 of Delaney Jenkins' sisters had been fatally attacked. Janiyah Jenkins, 21, and Ayani Jones, 10, were pronounced dead at the scene. Unlike cases where the perpetrator remains at the scene, Delaney reportedly fled, initiating a multi-day manhunt. Law enforcement mobilized immediately, searching the surrounding area. He was eventually apprehended in Downs Grove, about 20 miles away, while allegedly trying to sell his car and hide his phone, a detail prosecutors cited as evidence of calculated behavior rather than a temporary psychotic break. The tragedy was discovered not by police, but by the youngest members of the family who remained in the home. Jelani's 7-year-old brother found the sisters and, in a chillingly heroic act, grabbed his 3-year-old niece and ran to a neighbor's house to keep her safe. That child, who should have been protected by adults, was spared because of the bravery and presence of mind of her cousin. Ayani, only 10 years old, was on a Snapchat call with a friend when the attack began. According to reports, the friend heard Janaya's final words, "Don't kill the kids." These words reveal the final act of bravery from Janaya, who attempted to protect the youngest family members until the very end. Authorities determined early on that the violence did not involve an outside intruder. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of burglary, and no indication that anyone else had been present. The focus quickly narrowed to Delaney Jenkins, who was later apprehended by authorities. Details released by law enforcement indicated that the attack was sudden and severe. Prosecutors alleged that Delaney acted alone and that the violence unfolded quickly, giving Janaya and Ayani little opportunity to escape or seek help. The specific weapon involved was recovered, and forensic evidence supported the conclusion that the killings occurred inside the residence. What made the case especially disturbing was the absence of a publicly known motive at the time. Early interviews with family members and neighbors revealed no long-standing feuds, no documented threats, and no recent escalation that might have predicted such an outcome. Authorities described the incident as an abrupt and catastrophic eruption of violence within a family that appeared stable. As the investigation continued, attention turns to Jelani's mental state. Court records indicate that mental health evaluations were ordered soon after his arrest. Prosecutors acknowledged that understanding his psychological condition would be critical to determining how the case moved forward. Defense attorneys raised concerns about his mental stability, suggesting that his actions may have occurred during a severe mental health episode. Despite those considerations, prosecutors emphasized that 2 lives had been lost and that the evidence supported serious criminal charges. Delaney Jenkins was charged in connection with the deaths of Janaya and Ayani. The charges reflected the severity of the crime and the fact that there were multiple victims. For the Jenkins family, the aftermath was overwhelming. A mother lost 2 daughters in a single night, while her son faced the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. Relatives described the situation as incomprehensible, struggling to understand how a family conflict, or something unseen, could lead to such irreversible loss. The Streamwood community responded with shock and grief. Neighbors gathered quietly near the home as news spread. Vigils were held to honor Janaya and Ayani, whose lives ended inside the place they should have been safest. Community members described the family as private but kind, and many expressed disbelief that such violence could occur so suddenly. As the case progressed through the legal system, prosecutors continued to build their case using forensic findings, witness statements, and psychological assessments. The defense focused on Jelani's mental health, arguing that his capacity to understand or control his actions at the time of the killings would be central to any final outcome. By late 2025, the case remained active. Court proceedings moved deliberately, shaped by evaluations, hearings, and procedural delays. No final verdict had yet been reached. What remained uncontested, however, was the magnitude of the loss. The Jenkins case illustrates a pattern seen in some of the most devastating sibling homicides. There is no prolonged warning visible to the outside world, no long paper trail, no escalating public conflict. Instead, the violence erupts inside a shared home, driven by forces that family members may not fully understand until it is too late. For Delaney Jenkins, a single act destroyed his family and permanently altered his future. For Janaya, 21, and Ayani, 10, their lives ended abruptly and without explanation. For the 7-year-old brother who discovered the tragedy and saved his 3-year-old niece, childhood was fractured in an instant. And for the Streamwood community, the case served as a stark reminder that even in homes that appear stable and loving, a private crisis can turn into public tragedy in a matter of moments. This case is still unfolding, but its impact is already permanent. 2 sisters are gone, 1 brother was apprehended, and a family is left with questions that may never have clear answers. Case number 6. Brandon Gonsalves, Jr. In July 2012, West Palm Beach, Florida was shaken by a tragedy within one of its own families. Brandon Gonsalves, 23 years old, was arrested for the first-degree murder of his brother, Gerard Gonsalves, Jr. The two lived in the same household, and their relationship had been tense for years, though few expected it to end in fatal violence. Gerard, slightly younger than Brandon, was described by friends and neighbors as quiet and devoted to his faith. He was considered cautious, often avoiding conflict, and committed to his personal beliefs. Those closest to him saw a young man striving to live a principled life. Brandon, by contrast, had clashing viewpoints, both personally and spiritually, and the two brothers reportedly argued repeatedly over religion, lifestyle choices, and family responsibilities. On the day of the attack, police were called to the Gonsalves residence following a domestic disturbance. When officers arrived, Gerard had suffered stab wounds, and Brandon was taken into custody. Investigators alleged that the dispute had escalated inside the home, ultimately turning lethal. The murder weapon, a knife, was recovered at the scene. Blood spatter analysis confirmed the nature and trajectory of the injuries, indicating a close-range, direct attack. Forensic evidence suggested the violence was deliberate rather than accidental, providing investigators with a clear sequence of events to support the charge of first-degree murder. Neighbors and family members later testified that tensions between the brothers had been ongoing, particularly over differences in religious beliefs and personal conduct. Unlike cases of romantic jealousy or teenage frustration, as seen in the Marzan or Wittmann cases, the Gonsalves homicide illustrates that sibling violence can emerge from intellectual or spiritual divisions, not just emotional or romantic rivalry. These clashes, left unresolved, can escalate to tragedy even among adult siblings. Court records indicate that Brandon's actions were sudden but not impulsive. Evidence showed the arguments spiraled into a lethal confrontation, with the knife used to deliver fatal blows. The intensity of the attack, combined with forensic findings, helped prosecutors argue that this was an intentional act rather than a momentary lapse of judgment. While mental health factors were considered, the defense did not successfully frame the killing as an accident or the result of temporary incapacity. For the Gonsalves family, the consequences were immediate and devastating. One brother was dead, the other faced decades in prison. Relatives described the household as otherwise stable and were stunned that personal and spiritual differences could escalate so rapidly. Gerard, who had sought to live quietly and avoid conflict, became a victim of a deeper clash of beliefs and personalities that had remained unresolved. The West Palm Beach community responded with shock. Residents described the family as private but well-regarded. The suddenness of the crime, combined with the domestic and personal nature of the dispute, highlighted the unpredictable danger that can exist even in families who appear outwardly normal. Friends remembered Gerard as thoughtful, principled, and dedicated to his faith, a young man whose life was cut short by familial conflict. Court proceedings focused on intent, premeditation, and the escalation of personal and religious disagreements. The prosecution relied on witness testimony, forensic evidence, and the recovered knife to demonstrate that the attack was deliberate rather than a momentary lapse of judgment. While mental health factors were considered, the defense did not successfully frame the killing as an accident or the result of temporary incapacity. For the Gonsalves family, the case left permanent grief, unanswered questions, and a stark reminder of the potential consequences of unresolved sibling conflict.
Case number 7. Kathleen and Susan Worrall. Kathleen and Susan Worrall were sisters living in the Sydney suburb of Strathfield, Australia. Kathleen was 20 years old and studying arts. Susan was 18, a Year 12 student preparing for her final exams. To neighbors and classmates, the family appeared stable and middle class, with no outward signs of dysfunction. Inside the home, however, a serious medical and psychological crisis was unfolding, largely unseen. On October 10, 2008, that crisis turned fatal. Earlier that day, the sisters argued over a computer password. There had also been a lingering disagreement about a hair straightener. These were ordinary disputes, common between siblings sharing space, but investigators later determined that what followed was not a sudden snap. It was the final step in a disturbing progression. Court findings revealed that Kathleen had purchased knives in advance, specifically for the purpose of attacking her sister. Even more chilling, she had made 2 prior dry runs. On 2 separate occasions, Kathleen approached Susan with the weapon, but stopped herself and walked away. On the 3rd attempt, she followed through. Susan had just stepped out of the bathroom when Kathleen attacked. She was stabbed more than 50 times. During the assault, Susan pleaded with her sister, crying, "No, Kathleen, I love you, please stop." Her words underscored the devastating collapse of the sibling bond in real time. Susan died at the scene. Police quickly determined there was no intruder. Kathleen was arrested inside the home. From the outset, investigators noted the ferocity of the attack was wildly disproportionate to the trivial argument that preceded it. As the case moved through the courts, attention shifted from motive to medical causation. Kathleen Worrall suffered from congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH, a genetic condition in which the body cannot properly produce cortisol. When cortisol is absent, the body compensates by diverting hormone precursors into androgens, male hormones such as testosterone. In effect, the body begins poisoning its own regulatory system. Kathleen required lifelong hormone replacement medication to prevent this process. In the months leading up to the killing, she had stopped taking the medication, reportedly in an effort to lose weight. Without cortisol replacement, her hormone levels surged. Medical testing later showed her hormone levels had reached those of an adult male. Compounding this biological crisis was an underlying mood disorder, potentially bipolar disorder. Psychiatric experts testified that the interaction between untreated CAH and her mental illness caused a profound destabilization of her emotional control, impulse regulation, and judgment. The court accepted that Kathleen's mind was operating under what the judge described as a disability of the mind. She was not legally insane, but her capacity to restrain herself or think rationally was significantly impaired at the time of the attack. At the same time, the preparation mattered. The advance purchase of the knives and the aborted attempts demonstrated persistence and fixation. The case became a disturbing study in contradiction, biological impairment coexisting with moments of calculation. Kathleen was ultimately convicted of manslaughter, not murder, due to diminished responsibility. She was sentenced to a maximum of 6 years in prison. For Susan Worrall, the legal outcome changed nothing. She was remembered by teachers and classmates as focused and hardworking, nearing the completion of her secondary education. Her death devastated her school community and left a permanent void in her family. For the Worrall family, the loss was layered and unresolved. One daughter was dead. The other was imprisoned, not as a coldly rational killer, but as a young woman whose untreated medical condition had spiraled into catastrophic violence. In 2011, the tragedy deepened further. Kathleen Worrall was found dead in her prison cell. The cause was pulmonary thromboembolism, a sudden and fatal blockage of the lungs. Her death was ruled natural. With Kathleen's passing, the case ended without the possibility of long-term accountability, treatment, or rehabilitation. The legal process closed, but the damage was permanent. The Worrall case stands apart from sibling homicides driven by jealousy or rivalry. It illustrates how medical non-compliance, hormonal imbalance, and psychiatric vulnerability can intersect with intent in devastating ways. It is also a stark cautionary tale about the dangers of stopping essential medication without medical supervision. A disagreement over a password, a hair straightener, a body unable to regulate its own chemistry. Together, they ended a life and destroyed a family. Susan Worrall was 18 years old. Her final words were spoken to the sister she loved. And Kathleen Worrall, impaired by a biological and psychological collapse,
died before she could fully understand or atone for what she had done. The truth closed the case, but it offered no relief, only a warning.
Case number 8, Molly Bennett-Smith. Molly Bennett-Smith lived with his mother and older sister, Luca, in the St. Andrews area of Bristol. The family had moved to the UK from New Zealand following their parents' divorce. On the surface, their home appeared ordinary. Neighbors recalled a quiet household, with little to suggest the underlying tension that had quietly built over years. Molly, 17 at the time, struggled with severe dyslexia and dysgraphia, conditions that made reading and writing challenging and left him increasingly withdrawn. He spent much of his time gaming, often becoming detached from reality for hours at a stretch. Relations between Molly and Luca had long been strained. He later told police he believed she had been bullying him over the years, a claim that had intensified his frustration and resentment. Family members in the court were made aware that Molly had difficulty managing his emotions and coping with ongoing tension, leaving him vulnerable to sudden outbursts when provoked. Despite these struggles, nothing had prepared the family or the community for the night of October 20th, 2024, when everything changed. That evening, inside their home on Cromwell Road, a routine domestic interaction escalated into tragedy. Molly approached Luca in the lounge and asked if he could practice a headlock on her, a game they had played before. They had an agreement: if Luca tapped him on the arm, he would stop, but this time he did not. According to a statement he later gave to police, Molly had decided in advance that he would not stop. The argument and play became lethal within minutes. He held Luca in a headlock, strangling her before repeatedly stabbing her. After 20 minutes, Molly called emergency services, reporting the killing and admitting he had intended to take her life. When police arrived, Luca was already dead. Molly was arrested at the scene and charged with murder 2 days later. Investigators noted that there was no evidence of an external threat and no forced entry. Everything had occurred within the home, a space that had once been familiar and safe, now transformed into a scene of violence. During the trial, Molly's legal team outlined his mental and emotional struggles. They highlighted his learning disabilities, periods of dissociation while gaming, and his inability to cope with prolonged frustration and feelings of resentment toward his sister. They argued that while Molly's actions were deliberate, his impaired perception and emotional regulation had contributed to the escalation. Court records also noted that Molly had expressed genuine remorse for his actions, understanding the gravity of the crime and its consequences for his family. The prosecution emphasized the brutality of the attack. They detailed how a familiar, everyday interaction had quickly spiraled into lethal violence. The court heard that the killing was premeditated, even if it emerged from years of accumulated tension and emotional strain. It was a case that illustrated how unresolved domestic friction, when coupled with mental and emotional vulnerabilities, could erupt with devastating consequences. In March 2025, at Bristol Crown Court, Molly Bennett-Smith pled guilty to murder. Judge William Hart described the killing as shocking and brutal, telling the court that the parents had, in effect, lost 2 children, one to death, the other to life imprisonment. The judge acknowledged the mitigating factors of Molly's age, learning difficulties, and emotional struggles, but emphasized the severity of the act required a substantial sentence. Molly was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 10 years and 5 months before he could be considered for parole. For Luca Bennett-Smith, the loss ended her life inside her own home at the hands of someone she trusted implicitly. For her parents, the loss was unimaginable: a child taken violently, a son who would spend years behind bars. For Molly, the act ended his adolescence and defined the rest of his life, leaving him to confront not only the legal consequences, but the permanent impact of his actions on his family and the wider community. The case left a lasting mark on the St. Andrews community. Neighbors described shock and disbelief that such violence could erupt behind closed doors in an otherwise ordinary home. There were no warning signs visible to outsiders, no public indicators of the tension that had been brewing between siblings. It was a stark reminder that domestic crises can escalate without notice, and that the most devastating acts of violence often occur where people feel safest.
Molly Bennett-Smith's case is not one of strangers or random attacks. It is a story of private tension, mental and emotional struggle, and the consequences of unresolved conflict. It demonstrates how a combination of long-standing resentment, emotional vulnerability, and impulsivity can culminate in irreversible tragedy. Ordinary objects, ordinary rooms, and ordinary relationships became the setting for extraordinary loss. For Luca, her life ended far too soon. For Molly, a single decision reshaped everything he would ever know. And for the family, the community, and all who learn of this case, it remains a chilling example of how domestic friction and emotional strain, left unchecked, can erupt with devastating finality.
Case number 9. Ghazala Khan. Ghazala Khan was 18 years old. She was born and raised in Denmark to parents of Pakistani descent and lived in the town of Slagelse, around 100 kilometers west of Copenhagen. To outsiders, she was a young woman navigating school, friendships, and early adulthood. Inside her home, however, her life was governed by a different set of rules. Family honor came first. Obedience was expected. Marriage was not a personal choice, but a collective decision tied to reputation, tradition, and control. Ghazala had grown up balancing two worlds. At school and in public, she lived as a Danish teenager, fluent in the language and culture around her. At home, she was expected to follow strict family expectations rooted in patriarchal customs carried over from Pakistan. These expectations centered heavily on female behavior, particularly relationships and marriage. Any deviation was viewed not as independence, but as disgrace. For several years, Ghazala had been in a secret relationship with Imal Khan, an Afghan immigrant living in Denmark. She hid it carefully, aware of the consequences if her family found out. Rumors had circulated, tensions had risen, but everything changed in September 2005 when Ghazala made a decision that would cost her her life. On September 21, 2005, Ghazala and Imal married in a civil ceremony without her family's consent. The marriage was legal, quiet, and private. But when her family discovered what she had done, the reaction was immediate and severe. Her father declared that she had brought irreversible shame on the family. According to court testimony, relatives gathered and discussed how to respond. Within that discussion, a decision was made. Ghazala had to die to restore the family's honor. 2 days later, on September 23, 2005, Ghazala and her husband were outside Slagelse railway station in broad daylight. They were ambushed without warning. Ghazala's older brother approached and fired multiple shots at close range. Ghazala was struck repeatedly and died instantly at the scene. Imal was shot twice in the abdomen. He survived only after emergency surgery. The shooter fled immediately in a waiting vehicle. The attack was swift, controlled, and deliberate. This was not a spontaneous act of rage, it was an execution. Danish police launched an immediate investigation. From the outset, authorities treated the shooting as a targeted killing rather than random violence. Evidence quickly revealed that the murder had been planned. Phone records, witness statements, and later confessions showed that Ghazala's family had spent weeks tracking her movements after the marriage. She had been lured under the pretense of reconciliation, giving her family the opportunity to locate her. Investigators uncovered a coordinated effort involving at least 9 relatives and associates. Ghazala's father had ordered the killing. Her brother had carried it out. Other family members had supplied the firearm, provided transportation, assisted with surveillance, and helped conceal evidence after the attack. The violence was collective, not isolated. In court, prosecutors described the case as a textbook honor killing. There was no claim of mental illness, no suggestion of loss of control. The evidence showed planning, intent, and agreement among family members. The motive was clear. Ghazala's refusal to submit to an arranged marriage and her choice to choose her own partner were viewed as an unforgivable violation of family honor. The defense attempted to argue cultural pressure, describing the family as acting under traditional expectations imported from Pakistan. The court rejected this argument entirely.
the judges emphasized that Danish law applies equally to everyone, regardless of background or belief. Cultural tradition would not mitigate murder. In June 2006, a Danish court delivered its verdicts. 9 family members and associates were convicted of murder or aiding and abetting the killing. Ghazala's father received a life sentence. Her brother, who fired the fatal shots, was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Other relatives received sentences ranging from 4 to 14 years. All were ordered expelled from Denmark after completing their prison terms. The ruling marked one of the most extensive prosecutions of an honor killing in Europe. It sent a clear message that collective family violence, justified by reputation or tradition, would be treated as organized murder. For Ghazala Khan, the consequences of choosing her own life were fatal. She was killed not for committing a crime, but for asserting autonomy. Her life ended outside a train station, in public, executed by her own family to satisfy an idea of honor that valued reputation over human life. The case shocked Denmark. Media coverage was extensive, and public reaction was intense. The brutality of the killing, the number of family members involved, and the motive behind it forced a national reckoning over integration, parallel societies, and the limits of multicultural tolerance. Ghazala's death became a reference point in debates about honor-based violence across Europe. For Ghazala's family, everything was destroyed. For Danish society, the case exposed how deeply embedded honor codes can persist within immigrant communities. And for Ghazala herself, her life was cut short at 18 years old, remembered not for how she died, but for the freedom she tried to claim.
Case number 10. Lucas Christian Delaney. Lucas Christian Delaney was born in 1989 and grew up in Western Sydney alongside his younger sister, Gabriella Delaney. Gabriella was 20 years old in 2020, a university student with a creative talent for art and a close relationship with her family. To those around her, she was gentle, thoughtful, and deeply loved. The Delaney family home in Cambridge Park was not known for chaos or instability. From the outside, it appeared ordinary, quiet, and unremarkable. But behind closed doors, Lucas had been struggling for years. As an adult, he had been diagnosed with schizophrenia and substance misuse disorder. His life had been marked by periods of instability, drug use, and fractured routines. Despite this, the court would later make clear that his mental illness was not the driving force behind what happened. On the night that mattered most, it was drugs, not psychosis, that shaped his actions. On June 3, 2020, the Delaney household became the site of a sudden and catastrophic act of violence. Inside the family home, Lucas attacked his sister Gabriella with a hammer. The assault was sustained and ferocious. Court findings described extensive facial and bodily injuries, the result of repeated blows delivered at close range. There was no struggle that spilled outside the home, no attempt by Gabriella to flee. The violence unfolded entirely within the domestic space, in a place that should have been safe. The New South Wales Supreme Court would later describe the killing in stark terms: a vicious, violent, and brutal attack, carried out for no discernible reason. When the assault ended, Gabriella was dead. What followed was not panic, confession, or an immediate call for help. Instead, Lucas attempted to conceal what he had done. He wrapped his sister's body in a blanket and placed it on a bed inside the home. He then covered her with other objects, deliberately hiding her from view. For days, Gabriella's body remained there, undiscovered, while life outside continued as if nothing had happened. Lucas left the house and began moving between locations. Over the next 4 days, he stayed at various motels, using a credit card to book rooms. During this period, he continued using drugs, smoking cannabis and methamphetamine. He contacted family members and lied about Gabriella's whereabouts, creating the illusion that she was still alive. These actions would later weigh heavily against him in court. On June 8, 2020, the truth came to light. Gabriella's body was discovered inside the family home, wrapped and concealed.
The discovery sent shockwaves through the family, forcing them to confront not only the loss of a daughter and sister, but the unbearable reality of who was responsible. The following day, Lucas checked himself in to Cumberland Hospital, a mental health facility. It was there that police arrested him. During legal proceedings, Lucas claimed that he had been hallucinating at the time of the attack. He told the court he believed he was fighting a demon, something inhuman that could move through walls and furniture. He argued that he not known he was attacking his sister. The court rejected this account entirely. Justice Peter Garling found that Lucas was not experiencing a psychotic episode at the time of the killing. Instead, he ruled that Lucas was impaired solely by the temporary effects of drugs, cannabis, methamphetamine, or both. The judge concluded that Lucas was criminally responsible for his actions, pointing to the deliberate concealment of the body, his movements after the killing, and the lies he told the family members as evidence of awareness and intent. There was no accepted motive, no argument, no provocation, no explanation that could account for the brutality of the attack. In 2022, Lucas Christian Delaney pled guilty to murder. His early guilty plea resulted in a 25% reduction in his sentence. Even with that discount, the court emphasized the gravity of the crime and the profound harm it caused. He was sentenced to a maximum of 21 years in prison, with a non-parole period of 15 years and 9 months. He will be eligible for parole on March 8, 2036. During sentencing, victim impact statements were read aloud in court. Gabriella's family spoke of their devastation, confusion, and enduring grief. Her sister Rebecca addressed Lucas directly, telling him he had taken away the person who meant the most to her. Their words reflected not only loss, but the fracture of a family forced to live with an act that could never be undone. Gabriella Delaney was remembered as a talented young artist and a student at the University of Western Sydney, someone with a future that had barely begun. Her life ended violently inside her own home at the hands of her brother. The Delaney case stands apart from killings driven by psychosis or long-standing delusion. The court made it clear that this was not a failure of reality, but a drug-fueled collapse of judgment and restraint. Mental illness formed part of Lucas's background, but it did not excuse or explain the violence that unfolded. For the community, the case was deeply unsettling. It exposed how substance misuse can amplify volatility and aggression, turning familiar spaces into scenes of irreversible harm. A household that once contained siblings and shared history became the setting for a crime defined by silence, concealment, and aftermath. Lucas Christian Delaney will spend decades in custody, carrying responsibility for a single night that destroyed his family. Gabriella Delaney's life ended at 20 years old, her future erased by a moment of brutal violence. And for those left behind, the loss remains permanent, a reminder that sometimes the most devastating crimes do not come from strangers, but from within the walls of home itself.